Welcome everybody on for our third virtual session of our low-tech process-based restoration workshop. That is always a mouthful every time that I say it. And trying to explain to my board when I was first talking about this workshop, and they were like, what are you calling that again? And of course, we used the acronym LTPBR on all of our board meeting materials and stuff when I'm talking about it. And so they're always like asking, what is that again? And what so, but no, I'm excited to have everybody on today, and thank you for joining us. I'm really excited about the presentations for today. I think it's really going to give us all a lot to think about and some different approaches on looking at these types of projects and how to actually get them on the ground and get them implemented and some different labor sources. So we're going to have Casey Nordine with the Mule Deer Foundation start out first and talking to us about using volunteers for these projects. And that's going to be followed up with Autumn Holzgen talking about using Conservation Corps crews, which is another labor option that we have. And then Linette Sutphin with Pheasants Forever is going to talk about utilizing contractors, as well as Willow Bish with the Wyoming Game and Fish, and they're going to share some of their different experiences with working with contractors. And then we'll follow that up with Brian Stampe, and he is owner of, I believe, is it Canopy Care, I think is the name of the company. And he actually is working with Linette as a contractor on some of her projects, and is going to share a little bit about some of the things that he's learned in jumping into this kind of work, and what that's looked like for him. And it's going to be an exciting opportunity, I think, to ask some questions and really dive into what it looks like to be a contractor in this type of work. And I know we have some folks on with us today that are contractors or that are maybe looking at getting into this work. And so, I would really encourage you to take this opportunity to ask questions, really dive into this process. And this is an opportunity for us as, those that are trying to lead these projects and develop these projects and find funding and et cetera, to also look at ways that we can help you as contractors to better understand what it is that we're wanting to put on the ground and how we can communicate that and how we can work together. So I think it's a really neat opportunity to come together and really have some great discussions on all of this. So, and then we'll have a project summary at the end from Melanie. Oh, geez. Melanie, I just had your name on the tip of my tongue and then it just dropped off here. Purcell.
No worries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Melanie Purcell, she's with Sublette County Conservation District, and she's going to talk about some of the work that they've been doing over there. And she's also got some time-lapse videos that, if you have not seen yet, are really, really awesome, and really show, if you're trying to sell this to somebody or trying to show, the purpose behind these, they are a fantastic resource. And I'm super excited that she's going to be able to share those with us today. So we've got a great crew on today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Casey, and I'll let you take it off. And we are going to take a break here in a little bit, so we'll kind of see how time's going here. But yeah, we will take a break, and we'll have some Q&A sessions as well here later today. So, but if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll, so we don't forget them, and we'll make sure and hit those questions up. And if you'd rather jump on and ask your question, in person too, then we'll definitely have time for that as well. So with that, thanks everybody again for joining us. And Casey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Caleb. Like Caleb said, I'm Casey Nordine. I'm the Habitat Partnership Coordinator for the Mule Deer Foundation. I'm based out of the Black Hills on the South Dakota side, but work throughout the Great Plains. Is everybody able to see that PowerPoint all right? Good to go? Cool. If
Yep,
anyone
looks
has
good on my end,
questions,
Casey.
cool. If anyone has questions, feel free to raise a hand or throw it in the chat. And I know if any of the other presenters want to jump in and add some insight on volunteers, feel free to do that at any point as well. So just a quick introduction to Mule Deer Foundation. We're a conservation organization based in Clearfield, Utah, focused on the conservation of mule deer, blacktail, and their habitat. So basically the Western US up into Alaska. We've got about 60 employees across the country, and you can see some of the variety of expertise that we've got in those staff members. Here's just a quick look at some of the work that we did in 2024. So a couple hundred projects, close to 750,000 acres. The mileage metric you see on there is typically tied to migration corridors, habitat connectivity, things along those lines. And we have contracts or agreements and work with just about any land management agency or private landholder. So as we've discussed in some of the previous sessions, nonprofit organizations, conservation groups can be a good conduit to help do cross-boundary work and increase the scale of the project from smaller scale to something that's more landscape focused. So we wanted to tier this portion on scaling a project and kind of start from the ground level. So working with volunteers presents a lot of good opportunities and unique challenges, but it can be an effective tool, especially if you're at an experimental or pilot stage in your project. So kind of chat through what opportunities there might be for getting volunteer crews together, and then tier it up into when it makes sense to start working with crews or contractors or a combination of any of those. So I broke this out into just a simple who, what, when, where, and why format. And so when we're talking about working with volunteers, that can mean a few different things. And what I've found over the years of working with volunteers throughout the region is it's really important to get to know who it is you're working with and what their skill sets are, and partners. I think when we're talking about working with volunteers, it's easy to think, especially if you're part of an organization or a group, only tapping into the volunteers that you know directly or that are maybe members of your organization. But often there's opportunities to work with other partners, whether it's a land agency or a local private business that just wants to give back to a project in the community. There's a lot of people out there that are looking to donate their time and efforts for the good of everybody else. And I'll talk a little bit about what that can look like, but each volunteer brings their own skill set. So we have people that are, maybe engineers or work with heavy equipment, and, they can bring a skill set and capacity that other folks may not. And we have other people that maybe don't have experience working on the ground, but are an able body and just happy to help any way that they can. I know some of our valuable volunteers with Mule Deer Foundation are just those people that show up any chance that they have, and you can rely on them and say, hey, we've got this coming up. Can you help me get some people put together? And like I mentioned, we've got others that are private businesses that are happy to take a day off and close the office down and bring their entire staff out to help get a project done. So one example I want to mention, we worked with the Forest Service in the Mystic Ranger District, which is kind of central Black Hills. This is a couple of summers ago. And we're doing kind of a pilot project, doing some beaver dam analog installations in Silver Creek. And they were wanting to stage it into about 4 separate sections, doing some A/B testing, fencing out some areas, not fencing out others, having active cattle grazing in some areas and not in others. And so due to the scale, and with this being a pilot project, they had, I think, about 70 to 80 structures that they were looking to install. and relatively limited funding and Forest Service capacity due to the nature of the project. And so what ended up working out was building this little coalition or collaborative group that included Forest Service, South Dakota Game and Fish, American Bird Conservancy, Black Hills Fly Fishers, Mule Deer Foundation, some of the adjacent landowners. And we ended up getting, on any given day, we had, I think, 20 to 30 people that were able to come out and help facilitate building of those structures. And it was really cool collaborative effort. Like I mentioned, each group or each volunteer brings their own level of expertise. In this case, the Forest Service was able to utilize some of their equipment and staff to kind of prep the site. So they went out and identified ideal locations for structures. They put posts in most of the locations in advance, just to kind of make things easier and more digestible for the volunteers. So when they had that influx of, here's 20 to 30 bodies that basically haven't done this before but are wanting to help, they could just take us right out on site and say, all right, here's all the locations, here's some example structures that have been pre-built, and then kind of let us go after it. A cool thing that also happened with that is you'll get different degrees of engagement from volunteers. And so they've been working in Silver Creek for the last 2 or 3 summers since that initial pilot project was completed. And I know there's some folks from all of those groups that have really taken ownership of that project site and have gone back out multiple times to do maintenance on structures, develop new techniques, figure out what's working and what's not working. So just a good example of how kind of, many hands make light work. And we definitely got a lot more done than it could have been if it was just Forest Service or even just Forest Service and one of those other partner groups. So part of consideration when working with volunteers is just what it is that we're trying to accomplish, and if in fact volunteers can help in that scenario. So I believe Willow mentioned in one of our previous sessions the concept of working at a landscape level and doing large scale projects that are going to have an outsized impact rather than these postage stamp approaches, which maybe have a limited impact in a smaller area that's just not going to have a large ecological benefit. On the flip side of that is, we have to know what it is we want to accomplish. And so we've got these educational opportunities, workshops, pilot projects, like I mentioned, and all of those can be really good opportunities to work with volunteers. Sometimes going into a site, you're not sure what structures or techniques are going to work best. Funding might be limited. And so in those types of scenarios, it's a really good opportunity to work with volunteers on the upfront. And try a bunch of different things, have people, volunteer their time to go out and monitor and see what's working. As far as the wind goes, another thing that's helpful to consider with volunteers is just being realistic with what it is you're asking of them. So I think it's easy for those of us working at a professional level to say, all right, let's look at the calendar. When do I have a window between meetings, or what day works best for my schedule, and then just send out a call for volunteers and say, hey, here's the day and time. If you can make it, great. But I've found that volunteers are very appreciative of a little bit of extra effort and just touching base with them, seeing what works, especially if you have a core group of volunteers that do a really great job, is working with them. Sometimes it might mean scheduling something on a weekend or working in the later afternoon and evening when people can maybe get off work early, but working with them to make sure that you're being respectful of their time. And I'm made a note above, burnout is a real thing with volunteers. I think it's easy when you have a good volunteer or group of volunteers to just ask and ask and ask and expect that they're always going to be there to help, but making sure that we're respectful of their time and going that extra mile to be appreciative of the help that they're providing can go a long way in making sure you can avoid that burnout and they don't feel like you're just constantly asking for their help without them getting anything in return. Similar thought process on the location, so the where. being realistic when considering volunteer assistance for a project. We've certainly had some projects in the past where it's maybe 2 hours from the nearest town and there's no phone service and site access is very difficult. Lodging is either non-existent or very expensive. And so there's just certain considerations to take into place. If you're wanting to work with volunteers, make sure it's a realistic location. And again, that you're respectful of them. That it's not someplace they're going to have to spend, $200-300 a night on lodging, or that they're not going to be able to access the site. So just some of those logistics are something to keep in mind. And then the why, be able to identify why your project and goals are a good fit for volunteer assistance. Like I mentioned, some of those things might be limited funding or needing to try out different structures, different techniques. But when we're working with volunteers, it's important for them to understand why it is we're asking for help. So make sure that's something that you can easily identify and talk through with them. So as I mentioned on the other side, identifying relatively small projects that can best accommodate volunteer assistance. And I guess that can be relative as far as what small means. If you're working with 1 to 2 volunteers, that can be a different consideration than if you're working with a group, like I mentioned, that might be 20 or 30. And then utilizing volunteer labor to test a variety of structure types, materials, placements. One benefit this provides is reducing the initial project costs if we're doing a lot of experimentation and trying out several different techniques or structures. It's important to do what we can to watch costs. Often the funding might be limited or non-existent at that point in the project. And so whether it's somebody that can volunteer a little bit of equipment or materials or just time, working with volunteers can be a really good way to kind of trial and error until you figure out what it is you want to build into a larger scale and plan for that project. This will help identify project costs as well. And it's a bit of a proof of concept. So when you're working with a volunteer crew, doing that experimenting, figuring out what works, you can document those successes and lessons learned. And often we're working towards, possibly applying for a grant or a financial assistance program, seeking, an award or a donation to facilitate a larger scale project. So working with these volunteers to hammer out those details and kind of do the trial and error in advance can be a really successful way in securing larger funding for the full scale project in the future. Another consideration I wanted to mention when working with volunteers is identifying portions or certain treatments within a multi-treatment project where a volunteer can help expand the scope or broaden the scope of the project. So like I mentioned, if funding or workforce is restricting the scale of the project or is restricted towards other activities, volunteers might be a good opportunity to broaden the scope of the project. And in this case, that might mean including, low-tech structures and restoration that maybe wouldn't have normally been able to be facilitated in that project. So I wanted to share an example on what this could look like. Last year, we facilitated a project in the Powder River Basin, basically on the Wyoming-Montana border. And the funding and staffing capacity was tied to a lop and scatter thinning project addressing conifer encroachment into uplands and into these ephemeral draws with the intention of freeing up some groundwater. And that was kind of about half of our budget, and then the other half was focused on excavating a collapsed spring head, putting in a spring box and a stock tank. And so those two treatments or activity types were taking up our staff time and the budget, but we knew that there were some opportunities for low-tech structures within this same system. And so we were able to collaborate with a couple of partners, get some donated materials. We weren't able to secure any volunteers for this project because of the site location consideration, but had it been more easily accessible, it would have been a really good opportunity. And so we did some installation of pals and wattles and some of these ephemeral drainages that had seen a lot of cattle trailing and some channeling. You can see some of that in the photo on the right there. And so had this been more accessible, it would have been a really good opportunity. We had 2 staff members facilitating the work on this project, working with contractors, making sure structures and the thinning prescription was going as planned. Had we had a few more bodies, it was not technical work building those pals, so it would have been a really good opportunity for us to maybe spend a couple of hours training up some volunteers, and then maybe just checking in with them every few hours. This ended up taking our staff quite a bit longer than anticipated, just because we had those other activities going on. So utilizing volunteers to kind of stretch your bandwidth and get more done and maybe broaden that scope of the project, like I mentioned, can be a really good opportunity. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to share on volunteers. Like I mentioned, if any of the other presenters want to add in on that, happy to have you guys do that. But I know we'll probably touch on volunteer opportunities as we kind of tier this up into conservation crews and contractors.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, about the volunteer route, we can certainly address those too. I think we've got time to do that before we jump in to the next one here.
This is Paul. Let me turn my camera on. One of the things that you mentioned was the why, and I think that's critical with everyone. Having worked with volunteers, YCC crews and contractors, I think the why is absolutely essential, because ultimately how we build these things is important, but if people don't understand why they're doing it, I find that our structures are kind of haphazard. And taking the time at the beginning of the project to walk people through it, let them ask all the questions that they have. One of the things I always emphasize that there are no stupid questions. The only stupid question is the one that you never ask. And invariably, I find people will make comments or ask questions that make the projects better if they understand why they're doing it. So that part is really, really essential. I'm glad you brought that up, because without it, a lot of times, especially with YCC crews, they're eager to get going and they start moving fast, and they don't really understand why they're doing it. Then our structures can be kind of haphazard, and that knowledge is really essential to the success of the projects.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I'd add to that too. In the communication of the why, often your volunteer recruitment prior to the workday is contingent on them understanding that why as well. So if you can put together some digestible information on the benefits of this work and what we're trying to accomplish in advance, that response and interest leading up to the workday is going to be more well received and positive as well.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Casey, I have a question for you. I guess working with volunteers too. I guess I'm curious what your experience has been on time commitment, like typical time commitment from a volunteer group, and how do you approach that conversation? Or do you kind of come with a pre-structured idea of saying, hey, I'm planning on doing 4 hours, or are you typically doing more of a full day of 8 hours or more? Are you doing multiple days? Or I assume it probably varies, but I'd be curious on hearing more detail on kind of how you approach those conversations as to time commitment and length of time worked and some of those different things.
Yeah. We do kind of a combination of that. When we're working with larger groups, you kind of have to take into consideration basically you have your high performers and your people that maybe have never done the work before. And so you have to find this middle ground where you basically are accommodating those that have the least amount of capacity or ability when you're working with such a large number of people. We're pretty adamant about communicating expectations in advance. So typically, on a full work day, we might be starting by 9 o'clock, and some of that site accessibility too. We try not to have volunteers out there for more than like 5 to 7 hours at a time, but you also get those that are happy to stay and work longer. And then also we often structure multi-day opportunities to kind of cast a broad net. So it might be something where we say, all right, we're going to be, working from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And so, you might catch only a handful of people on one of those days, but you might have 20 people on one of those days. And then one of the things that we learn during those larger group events is who those high performers are and the people that want to get more engaged and have the skill set to provide a large amount of benefit. And so like that Silver Creek example I mentioned, there was some really dedicated volunteers from the Black Hills Fly Fisher group. And so they started working directly with the project leads outside of the larger volunteer work days. And I know some of those volunteers, basically donated, 100 plus 150 hours of time over a couple of weeks to go out there, maintain structures, develop new techniques. So, they, like I mentioned earlier, they really took ownership. So some of, the volunteer groups take a little bit more finesse and not asking too much. But then once you develop those relationships with the really high performers and dedicated volunteers, they'll kind of help you know how much you can ask of them and what's realistic.
And I guess a follow-up on that too is, how do you usually do meals for like a lunch for that? Or is that something you're providing, or do you tell them to bring their own, or maybe that varies too on stuff? But what have you found successful and a good approach to handling meals, snacks, water, and drinks and so on?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, it's really easy when working with volunteers to not realize you're just asking and asking and asking, and just it's a one directional relationship at that point. And so supplying meals, especially if you have the opportunity to bring out a little portable grill and do hot dogs or burgers, just like a little bit of warm food and a cold drink in the middle of the day after they've been working hard for a few hours, goes a long way, and just is one way to show a little bit of appreciation. So anytime we can do that, we do. Sometimes it's dictated by project budget if we've got a way to facilitate that, but often even we'll just end up paying for something out of our personal pocket, just because we end up, like I said, developing those personal relationships with these volunteers where I don't mind spending $30-40 on some hamburgers and hot dogs to make sure that I'm maintaining a good relationship with those folks. And then kind of on a little bit of a tangent, but same vein, we host some volunteer recognition events throughout the year. And so again, it's just another little way to maintain a positive relationship and show those people that we really value the time and effort and resources that they're putting into these projects. And a good way to say, like, hey, come enjoy this, happy hour or free meal or whatever it is. We're not asking anything out of you at this moment. We're just saying thank you for everything you've done. And that's another good way to retain volunteers and avoid that burnout.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, Casey. Let's go ahead and move into Autumn's presentation here, using Youth Conservation Corps crews. And yeah, feel free to chime in with questions here as we go along with as well. So thanks everybody, and I'll turn that over to Autumn.
Okay, can everyone see my screen okay? The presentation?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right. Yes. So hi, everybody. My name is Autumn Holzgen. I'm with Montana Conservation Corps as their Northern Great Plains Program Manager. And I will be talking to you guys about what it's like working with Conservation Corps crews. It's just kind of funny. I mean, I guess they picked the right kind of person to talk about this subject, being that I am employed through a Conservation Corps. So yeah, I guess you could say I know a thing or two, but I'm happy to share with you guys what Conservation Corps are all about today. I had this slide in the last presentation for session 2, but for anyone that's new on the call today, I just wanted to throw it back up there. So for anyone that doesn't know who MCC is, at Montana Conservation Corps, we are a conservation-minded nonprofit, and our mission is to inspire young people through hands-on conservation service to be leaders, stewards of the land, and engaged citizens who improve their communities. And we work to achieve that mission through enrolling over 500 youth and young adults in our AmeriCorps programs every single year. Okay, so what exactly is a conservation corps? Corps are local organizations that engage young adults, generally anywhere from like 16 to 30 years old, and veterans up to age 35, in service service projects that address conservation and community needs. Just for everyone's knowledge, there are conservation corps spread out all across the country. Many live in certain states, but then can bleed out into other states, send their crews across the country for disaster relief and things like that. But generally, there are hundreds of conservation corps all across our country. And they don't actually all operate the same, but the basic principle of running conservation programs catered towards young adults and addressing local community needs is generally consistent across all conservation corps. Those solid principles are the same, but how they logistically go about running their programs and a few other aspects might differ depending on the state, the region, the area that they're in the country. But those are typically the staples of a conservation corps program. So, like any position, conservation corps will post their corps member positions online and start accepting applications and go through the typical interview process to find the best candidate. And so when these young adults sign up for these conservation corps programs, they are essentially kind of signing up for somewhat of a package deal. And that's what I was trying to embody there in that little image there in the middle of the screen. Essentially what that package deal typically looks like for these corps members. But when they do sign up for these programs, go through the interview process, get accepted, they are agreeing to serve for a set term. So they are not technically employed. They are doing a national service term. And depending on what program you're serving in, these members are serving in, they can serve anywhere from a few months to a year, but typically not any longer than that. These members also receive a living stipend or a stipend or a living allowance. And after they complete their service term, typically they will be eligible to receive an educational award or a scholarship. In addition to their service term, they will have access to educational programming, mentoring, and access to career and personal counseling. So again, that's that package that they typically goes alongside conservation corps programs. Altogether, conservation corps programs are really meant to be the stepping stone and help a lot of young adults try new things, gain experience, and ultimately help them reach their goal. And when all is said and done, hopefully become future conservation leaders for our country. So additionally, the majority of Conservation Corps programs across the country do utilize AmeriCorps, the federal agency, to run their program. For those who may not be aware, AmeriCorps is a federal agency for national service and volunteerism. And one of AmeriCorps' resources is to provide competitive national and state grants to support programs that instill the principles of community service. So if you're adding everything up, it totally makes sense why a lot of Conservation Corps programs use AmeriCorps dollars and grants, because the principles are the same and they're more eligible for those type of grants. But I just wanted to make it widely known that not all conservation corps across our country use AmeriCorps grants. Some other states, it's written into the state budget, so they receive money directly from the state to run their Conservation Corps programs. A lot of the Conservation Corps programs are part of a nonprofit, so accept donations, private dollars, and those other NGOs write grants to help offset the costs of running these Conservation Corps crews. So just wanted to put that out there so everyone knows kind of typically what fuels and funds these types of programs for young adults. Okay, so now that we generally know what makes up a Conservation Corps, let's talk about how Conservation Corps crew models can help you scale up your project work. So first and foremost, conservation crews do go through extensive training before launching into their field season. So over on the left-hand side of the slide, putting in their leadership development training. So typically the field season, depending on the type of program, typically runs from May to October. But these leaders that are going to be out in the field running these conservation crews will arrive in February to the organization and start launching into leadership development training, which again is part of that package deal of signing up for these types of programs, is we want to give these young adults that skill set needed to become future leaders. So it's like 2 months long of like intensive leadership training. We have people come in outside of the organization who are skilled and know how to share these resources with these members. Additionally, they will go through technical skills training and certifications. So the basics are like any sort of saw training that is needed to do the work. They will go through that. If they're treating an invasive species, they will go through what it takes to get their pesticide license. Any sort of technical skills needed on the ground, like for instance, doing the low-tech restoration work, it's pretty technical and understanding what types of structures do what their functionality is, how to build them, where to place them, that kind of thing. So they'll go through a month-long training of how to implement low-tech projects. Additionally, these crews are set up with the right gear, tools, and equipment to be provided on site. So yeah, they'll arrive on site. I have a picture of their pickup truck and their trailers and their hydraulic post pounders. So as an organization, providing them with everything that they need to get the job done on the ground and be successful. Their own tools, their own trailers, and things like that. Yeah, so essentially have everything ready to go for the job. Additionally, the crews typically do embody that sense of independence and autonomy. So we really want to set them up for success and have them, since they've come in early, they've gotten all this training, we're setting them up, and we want them to rely on that training and feel confident leading these crews throughout the field season. So just for an example, with our organization, we write project information sheets, and on that it's like their Bible. It has everything they need to know in order to do the job and be successful, and meet project expectations. So they are pretty independent in that sense. I will say though, typically with these Conservation Corps groups, it's not that we drop them off in the middle of nowhere and say, see you later. We do try and encourage some sort of partner interaction or direction, especially on day one. It just really helps set the project up for success. So I wouldn't necessarily say 100% independence, because they are still young adults. They are still learning. And so having some sort of sense of direction on the first day of the project is typically advised through organizations that run these types of core programs. But for the most part, we want to make sure that they have that kind of sense of independence throughout. Something else that kind of sets them apart and helps them scale up project work is they do work longer days and continuous days. So, for example, they go out and do these continuous 9-day hitches. We call it a hitch, so continuous 9 days of work, and typically work 10-hour days with travel mixed in to and from the site as well. So yeah, 9-10-hour days typically makes up a full hitch. So when they're out there, they're out there. When they're out there for that long and for those sort of continuous string of days, they are set up with their own camping gear, their own water, their own food, and they know how to dig a latrine and go to the bathroom and bury that. So they're pretty much set up to survive in the middle of nowhere for a little while. So that kind of sets them apart as well. Something to be mindful of is they are not typically free. The crews do often require partner contribution for the work, but the good news is grants can cover a lot of the cost to cover a lot of the cost to getting a hitch on the ground. So whether that's the internal organization having grants to cover the cost or partners fundraise their own grants and apply for their own grants to cover the cost, but just generally realizing that there is typically, a cost associated to getting hitches on the ground for conservation corps. So just kind of summarizing it here, how they help scale up projects and things to be mindful of. They cannot work with large equipment, so they will not be operating large equipment, but they can have access to hand tools, power tools, and things like that. So depending on what is needed for your type of project, just keeping that in mind. They are typically solely just implementation-based, labor-based, and so the type of conservation corps crews will not have any sort of like planning or knowledge, but more or less just show up and get the work done. So something to consider as well. But the good news is if you've got like 2 miles of stream to work on and 80 structures to build, that's very doable for a conservation corps. It might just take 2 hitches to do it. And as an organization, it's our job to be able to tell you, generally in 1 hitch, they can get this amount of work done. So it helps you as a practitioner plan and understand how many hitches it would take to help you reach your goals. And another thing to keep in mind generally is these are growth programs, young adult community engagement programs. And so opportunities for them when they're off hitch and out in rural places to attend local meetings or local events. So kind of like as a project partner, understanding that these young adults want time to engage with their local community. So it is still that kind of growth model mindset program. So now that we generally know what a conservation corps is and how they can help scale up a project, I wanted to kind of hone in and share with you all Montana Conservation Corps' crew model as an example. So with our Conservation Corps crew model, I think I already mentioned it earlier, but our crews will serve from May to October. So that's their field season. Leaders will get here in February, go through that extensive training, and then their members will show up at the end of April. They'll make a full crew and then get ready to launch. The crews range anywhere from 4 to 6 people and typically have anywhere from 1 to 2 leaders on these crews. And like I mentioned, spend several days out in the field. They can do various different types of conservation-minded work, trail maintenance, watershed restoration, noxious weed planting, backcountry stuff, forest files reduction, etc. So in addition to our traditional crew model, I definitely needed to throw this up there. We can also formalize specialized crews based on partner and resource needs. So as a quick story time for everybody, MCC, along with partners and stakeholders in Central and Eastern Montana, recognize the severity of drought on the landscape and the potential proactive restoration solutions like low-tech restoration. But one of the biggest hurdles that was talked about across the partners, was that there was just a lack of knowledge and labor around the idea of implementing different types of restoration methods. So it's like, we understand what the problem is, we see what the solution can be, but the hurdle is we don't really have anyone specialized that knows how to do this in our area of central and eastern Montana for the most part. So MCC internally reflected on our traditional crew model and came up with the idea of creating a specialized crew. So that's what you guys see here on this screen here. We decided that the 4-person crews would be best to work on these types of mesic and low-tech restoration projects. Like I already mentioned before, they spent an entire month just solely focusing on how to implement low-tech process-based restoration on the landscape, how to read degradation, how to build structures, how to maintain structures, what kind of tools do you need, what type of materials, etc. We kind of launched this idea of a specialized crew in 2022 with just 1 adult and 1 youth crew. And since then, in 2025, because the demand in doing this work and the success of these specialized crews was so great, we are now growing to meet that demand and increasing to up to 4 specialized crews in 2025, where they will do nothing but do mesic restoration, low-tech restoration work from May to October. So with 4 of those crews focusing on that for that many months, you can imagine the amount of work that gets done. It's pretty incredible. But yeah, so in 2024, after just 2 full seasons of these specialized crews, we have reached over 2,000 low-tech structures built. So here are just a quick examples of the types of mesic restoration methods that these Conservation Corps specialized crews can implement. Outside of just the low-tech stuff, which is typically the most popular for mesic restoration, they can do more riparian plantings and invasive species removal, some fence modifications around the riparian area, and conifer encroachment removal. So although they focus a lot on low-tech restoration, we really want to create that holistic package of the specialized crew to impact the whole mesic area. I just threw this up here as just an example of our work, of the different types of low-tech structures that we've been able to build across the landscape, and kind of just like pick on that structure there on the bottom right-hand corner. Aside from just getting the basics down and building the types of low-tech structures that exist in the textbooks, our crews and our leadership have really started to like read the landscape and take the principles of certain structures, but modify them and adapt them based off of the types of degradation that we were seeing on the landscape, which is pretty cool. So these crews learned how to like, yeah, be adaptable and create this sort of structure called a low bank builder in that bottom right-hand corner. So we build these on vertical, tall, kind of like bare, naked banks. And the idea is with this post-line wicker weave, typically 1 to 2 layers deep, as that sediment kind of sloughs off, it would be captured by that post-line willow weave and work to lay that bank back. And then as we're weaving these willows through the posts, we're leaving about a foot's worth of distance from the bottom of the stream channel. So it also provides fish habitat and cover. So we've seen these structures work as that sediment is being captured. Vegetation is allowed to establish. That bank eventually does start to slope back. It does take a while, and these structures obviously do need maintenance, but it's pretty incredible when you send specialized crews out there and they just start bringing nuggets of information back to you of like, what if we tweak this and what if we use this materials? Like cool things like this end up happening. And so we're very thankful that we can send these adults out there and get them to learn and try new things. So rounding out the presentation, I definitely wanted to throw this slide in there. Just really beyond the on-the-ground work, it's very important to highlight that Conservation Corps crews offer opportunities for members to interact and engage with rural communities and all community types. And really just the chance to develop new and exciting experiences. So we pull young adults from all over the country and place them all throughout Montana and into the surrounding states as well. And so you can imagine the type of experiences that they are getting and exploring new places. So I feel like these pictures and quotes really just capture the types of experiences that they're able to get. I love the photo in the upper left-hand corner. They do stretch circle every morning. And so they were out in, I think, Winnet, Montana. And the pigs decided to join the stretch circle, which is pretty cool. If that doesn't embody working in rural communities, I don't know what does. Yeah, and then there's a lot of opportunities for landowners and ranchers to interact with these members, teach them a thing or two, get them to understand what it's like living and working off the land. I have some pretty cool quotes in here that I've gotten from members over the years. We had one leader come back and do a second service term, and he said he liked the work, but more or less he really came back because he liked connecting with rural communities across central and eastern Montana. So he missed that piece of the work and really wanted to come back and dive even deeper into these communities. And then we had a crew leader who was vegetarian for 7 years, but after spending a hitch on a ranch, got to learn how these livestock were treated. And so we threw like a end of hitch cookout for the crew, and the ranch manager cooked up some beef burgers from their cattle. And that crew leader decided to eat a beef burger for the first time in 7 years because she's like, I've worked here for the last 9 days. I understand how they're treated. That was her biggest, I guess, gripe, if you want to call it that. But it was pretty cool to see her mindset kind of like switch in that moment and appreciate how, yeah, what it's like to work and live off the land and produce meat cattle. So yeah, it was pretty cool to see that kind of experience come from that member. This is the last slide here. Just really wanted to showcase and capture just how much Conservation Corps programs can really achieve just after 1 year. I took this snapshot from our annual report as an example. So yeah, just after 1 year, across all of our 45 Conservation Corps crews, we've built over 2,500 beaver dam analogs, have reached 100 miles of fence improved, 30 miles of streams restored, 15,000 acres of habitat. I mean, I don't have to read all the stats, but yeah, deploying 500 AmeriCorps members is a lot, and we do a lot of good work, and we're very thankful for the chance to connect these young adults to these kind of unique experiences and work with such unique and amazing partners that we have. And that's all I have. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Autumn, for that. And I definitely learned a lot about what you guys have to offer and the capacity of what you're able to accomplish. That just blows my mind. Yeah, that is really awesome. Excuse me. Anybody have any questions on using a Conservation Corps crew and what that might look like?
Autumn, could you talk a little bit about any experiences where the conservation crews have worked alongside either volunteers or contractors?
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. I was definitely going to bring it up myself anyways, because it's so important to definitely say that. Yeah, there have been a lot of instances and projects where this conservation crew labor source has been meshed with a contractor and meshed with volunteers. For some of the projects that I plan for Montana Conservation Corps with our crews, I typically always try, of the 9 days, I always try and book one volunteer day, and then start recruiting throughout our other programs, through community members, through local chapters and things like that. But I always try and build that in. People I think the cruise, it's a morale boost for crews to have visitors, especially if they're working in the middle of nowhere. And just like kind of get that interaction with people coming out and helping to volunteer. And you can't deny a crew plus volunteers, the work just explodes from there. Because of the leadership training, these crews can actually help teach volunteers how to do this work. And as one that manages this crew, I think it's good, like leadership training to make them kind of push them outside of their comfort zone and be like, hey guys, there's a volunteer event towards the end of your hitch. You're going to help train these volunteers, lead these volunteers. So they can kind of take some of that load off and get that experience doing so. So yeah, absolutely tons of opportunities for crews and volunteers to mesh together. On the contractor side, we have projects where partners contract for the planning aspects and the oversight. So the contractor will just be there to lay out the project, but also be there to oversee the Conservation Corps crew. So they're almost seen as the project lead, and then the crew is just the labor source. And so they mesh really well and take direction and leadership from that contractor that is there to plan and lead those projects. We've also worked with a contracting group, Anna Branch, if you guys are familiar. They're a big one. The project partner had the budget to hire them and hire us. And so, oh my gosh, the amount of work the Conservation Corps crews and the contracting consultant Anna Branch was able to bring was incredible. So they could operate maybe typically some of those heavier equipments and the UTVs and things. And then the crew would help get materials. And so they divided up responsibilities and roles and took direction really well. So I could just go on, but like absolutely there are tons of opportunities to blend and mesh volunteers, Conservation Corps crews, and contracting crews as well.
Awesome. Thanks.
I think the neat thing that I like about it is I think it's such a cool opportunity to not only have increase our capacity to get something done and get a crew that, you know, maybe has done some of this work before and is ready to hit the ground running, but it's also a neat opportunity to also, you know, share the why. And we talked a little bit about this with working with volunteers, and I think it's so awesome to have the opportunity to then, you know, share those why and inspire others to maybe have the same passion that we have for these types of projects. And I really would like to, I'm hoping at some point to be able to work with some Conservation Corps crews, just because I think it's so neat to inspire the next generation of conservationists and those that want to, you know, continue this effort that we're all here doing, trying to manage and preserve and utilize in a sustainable manner the natural resources that we have. So so neat opportunity there. And if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and move on. Oh yeah, Paul,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Sorry, this is Paul again. First off, I want to put a big plug in for Autumn's program. I work down here in Colorado a lot, and Colorado's structured very differently. Montana has a centralized program. So basically you're dealing with one entity. Here in Colorado, I have to deal with several different YCC crew offices for each, depending on where we are in the state. I think the Montana approach with these specialized crews is really beneficial, because working in a setting where I have to work with different YCC crews on different hitches, a lot of times I don't get the same crew back. And so I'm constantly retraining them, which as a contractor can be, it slows the project down. And when we have these dedicated crews, what they can get done is really phenomenal. They're much more independent, and they're much more capable of taking on a more advanced leadership role. The other thing too that you get is you don't end up with the, you know, YCC kids they're pretty raw when they come into these programs, and without good crew supervisor, crew leadership, the value of the crews can vary significantly. But again, with the Montana model, where these folks get trained and they're specialized when they come into the field, they're much more effective and very, very adept at getting their work done. And the creativity that you see in some of the structures that her crew is designing, I think is absolutely essential for what we do. Because, you know, we can give you guys a bunch of plans, but each structure is going to be different and each setting is a little bit different and each structure ends up being tweaked. And having a crew that has enough experience to be able to make those and call those audibles in the field, so to speak, is really, really beneficial. So I think the world of the Montana model, and I just wish we had it here in Colorado, but it's a fantastic program, and having those dedicated teams is a very effective way to get work on the ground.
Thanks, Paul. That was very kind. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and I'll just put out there, because of some of the grants we've been able to receive, national grants, although our home base is Montana, we do send our crews to neighboring states. So like Idaho, the Dakotas, and into Wyoming. So we can deploy our crews to work outside of Montana. I know it's a little confusing because we're Montana Conservation Corps, but just so everyone knows, we can work outside of Montana. We have sent our crews all the way to Florida for disaster relief as well. So, yeah, I mean, to the best of our ability, because we only have so many crews, you know, can't be everywhere all the time, all at once, but we'd love to help out to the best of our ability. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Autumn, very much. And let's go ahead and move into our next presentation. This is going to be from Linette. And we're going to begin continue this scaling up kind of format that we approached for today's presentations. And we're going to move into discussions about utilizing contractors in these types of projects. So Linette, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
So I'm Linette Sutphin. I am a coordinating wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever in Northeast Wyoming. Pheasants Forever's mission is to conserve pheasants, quail, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public access, education, and conservation advocacy. It was founded in 1982 by a group of hunters who recognized the link between habitat loss and declining upland bird populations. So the purpose of my position is to increase capacity for specifically sage-grouse habitat enhancement and restoration. And as a coordinating wildlife biologist, I work with several supporting partners and other partners in my region. So it's known as the Habitat Organization, and we operate in over 40 U.S. states with 480,000 members, over 300 biologists, and 750 local chapters. Our model is unique in that the local chapters retain control over all of their locally raised funds so that they can directly invest in local habitat projects and community-based conservation and education. So I thought I'd just kind of start with how my project evolved. I started out with a music restoration workshop as I was learning more about this type of work. And I worked with Paul to lay out the draw that we had chosen and stake out the structures. We wanted to get more contractors involved in this type of work, just like Caleb is trying to do. And as Casey mentioned, experiment with different materials and methods so we could get an idea of what a larger project might entail. I was able to hire a contractor to finish out our draw, which also helped with estimating costs as we made our future plans and looked at funding options. So as I look towards scaling up, my focus was on music habitat restoration in sage-grouse habitat. So, I took all the available information I had at my disposal, including our sage-grouse core areas, lek locations, nesting and brood rearing locations from previous research that had been done in the area, the sagebrush conservation design model, and then just general local knowledge of the area, access to project sites, and what type of landowner cooperation I might be able to get. So after I identified my focus area, I was moving on to looking at the size of my project, my budgeting, and then moving on to getting the details that I would need to move forward. So the first thing that I did once I identified my project area was to just quickly walk the draws. I basically went out there with my GPS and marked any potential structure locations, and I would jot down what type of structure might work best in that area. And just a rough idea of sizes. I didn't specifically measure them yet. But this was able to give me an idea of what my budget might look like once I had, the rough number and the sizes. So at that point, I knew with my current budget that I'd need to divide my project into phases while I pursued other funding. So once I had that figured out, I had my first few draws that I was going to move forward with. So I went out and I specifically marked each structure and staked each structure with the structure ID, the type, the materials I wanted to use, and then what were my priority structures along with each measurement for those structures. Some optional things that I want to make sure I do moving forward, especially since I had a fire go through my area and had to go out and find more stakes, and is, maybe spray paint the stake tops. Make sure you include comments in your notes about what your intentions might be with each structure, because that might decide how the structure would be positioned. And just a small thing, but maybe be consistent about which side of the structure the stake is placed. And then Brian will talk about more details to be aware of when you're out there staking and measuring that can help contractors or other people that might be working on your project. So I thought I'd put together, just talk about some of the materials that you put together when you're preparing your RFPs for contractors. At least in my experience, I'm always learning. It was really cool to, learn that Willow had used Google My Maps. That seems like it's going to be a great resource to be able to share your data, your locations, any photos that you have. So this is just a general data sheet with, the structures, the measurements, any notes you might have for each structure, your priorities, and then also what type of materials, you might be flexible and give your contractor an option to do, say, a one rock dam or a wicker weir, given their preference. And so those are good notes to include as well in your RFPs. So when I began mapping this out so that I could present it in the RFP to contractors, I had my spreadsheet, and then I made kind of a detailed map. There are some things that actually I hadn't included on my original RFP that I thought about, like including where fences are, if you know, where gates might be, because these fences that are crossing draws might prevent easy access for your contractors when they're trying to stage material and just get around the site in general. So I included my draws and my structure locations. I had some georeference photos, although a lot of contractors are going to want to go out and visit the site anyway. And then I included 2 tracks. How can they get into the area? Where can they drive or not drive? And then you want to include, as Willow will likely mention, timing stipulations. And then, there's all different ways to share these files. Like Google My Maps. I think any of those free resources, I've found that a lot of people are using, KMZs and KMLs so that they can get out there, because that's also a really easy option to work with. And I guess that's pretty much it. That went a lot quicker than expected. But yeah, let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, I think that's it.
Great. Well, thanks, Linette, for sharing that process there, and some of the important aspects of what you consider through that process. I did have a question on kind of what time frame you're looking at when you are putting out an RFP and requesting bids come back. from contractors, what kind of time frame are you looking at on that?
I put out, I guess, the first two RFPs that I've put out so far, it's just a couple months from the time that I put out the RFP to, yeah, a month to 2 months. I think to when I choose a contractor and start moving forward. I want to give them time to get out on the site and check it out and you know, come back to me with any questions they might have when they're preparing their bids.
Are you going out on site with them, or are you just telling them where it's at and getting permission from the landowner for them to go visit on their own, or a little of both? Or
Yeah, in my RFP, I just say they need, you know, to reach out to me and then I can arrange access. If they want me to go out, I can, but as long as it's okay with the landowner, I can just make sure they know how to get there and give them anything they need to make sure they're able to find the site easily.
any other questions on anything with regards to working with contractors?
And I can share, if it's helpful, I have just kind of a template RFP that I use, you know, following kind of Pheasants Forever's methods that we need to use. I have to put anything over $10,000 out to bid. So I'm happy to, I can share that in the chat in case it helps people so that, you know, at least they maybe have the template or there's some ideas they can pull from that if they need to prepare their own RFP for this type of work.
Yeah, no, that would be great. Yeah, thanks, Linette, for being willing to share that. So that's a great resource for those of us. I know for me, I'm still learning on that process. So I would be very interested in seeing what has worked for you. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to
Go
add
ahead.
a little bit from like a contractor's perspective. Linette's RFPs are super easy to follow and are really easy to bid on. And the more dialed in you get, like Linette, the less risk the contractor feels like they're taking on, and it ends up making bids come in cheaper. So definitely check out like Linette's stuff if anyone's considering putting one of these together, because the way she's done it and included so many details really signals to the bidder that, hey, like they've thought about all these things, they're easy to work with, they're dialed in, and it really makes it nice to bid, and that just ends up getting you more bids and cheaper bids. So yeah, I just wanted to plug that if anyone is looking to like adjust their RFPs, Linette's stuff is a really good model.
And then I see Matt has how do I share the RFP? So I share my RFP with Pheasants Forever. We have a website for sharing them out, and so then I have a link that I can then put out, you know, share with other people so they can spread the word. So far, that's all I've had to do. As far as qualified contractors, that's kind of, I think, what we're all working toward is getting more contractors into this kind of work. I mean, fortunately, Brian came to the workshop that I held, and then Brooks Priest with watershed restoration, both of them, and I think Grouse Mountain Consultants is also getting into this field. I know they've done some work in the southern US, but I think it's growing. I think we're getting more contractors on board so that we can continue to scale up.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Matt. And I think that at this point, maybe reaching out to those that have already done projects and have contacts with contractors that are interested. But yeah, I think that is a challenge right now because there's not a lot of contractors doing this, but we've had quite a few that have expressed interest in this workshop, and so hopefully this is going to be an opportunity to, you know, continue to build relationships on with some of these different folks that are interested in getting into it, and so that, yeah, that's definitely what we're hoping for here. So And yeah, so any other questions on any of that? Or anything
Yeah,
we've covered so
I guess
far?
I could just say, I've only worked with Brian so far, but he's been really great to work with and really cares about the work that he does. So he does really high quality work.
Yeah, and we'll be hearing more from Brian here in a little bit on what his experience has been too on being a contractor and all of that too. So excited to hear his perspective. So with that, we're going to go ahead and move into a presentation from Willow Bish with the Wyoming Game and Fish. And she's going to talk about some of her experiences working with contractors and share some things that she's learned from that as well. So, so Willow, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hi everyone. Awesome presentations today. I know that I personally really kind of thrive on inspiration, and I always love hearing people's stories. I didn't do a PowerPoint for this. I'm just going to chat with you all about how we came to actually putting projects on the ground. We knew that we didn't have any contractors. So a lot of times when we're doing work that's really well known, so you're spraying cheatgrass, you're doing conifer removal, riparian plantings, anything like that, there's qualified contractors out there. We can put together specifications, put them out for bid, and our internal state process, it goes through public purchase, and then I can request that certain contractors be notified. And so it's a mixed bag. We get contractors that I specifically send the info to through public purchase, but as well, other new contractors can see that. And every once in a while, I get somebody new on board I'm not anticipating. But going into doing this kind of work, I didn't even have enough knowledge to write really good specifications to put the things out for bid. And then also the contractors, I felt like, who would be interested, they didn't know how to bid. They didn't know what the cost of doing these projects were. So the Thunder Basin project that I work on, we have some of that money go through the Thunder Basin Prairie Grassland Ecosystem Association, where Dave Pellets has the ability to directly hire contractors without having to go through a process. So basically, I just handpicked my kind of favorite conservation contractor that I've worked with, who has really done some different things for me, kind of some innovative techniques that I've worked with their crew on previously. And I knew that they would be able to come online to this work really well. We knew that we would have to train them. And so Paul really helped us out with that, bringing him on board and getting them trained. But we were able to just pay them time and materials to do the work. And then I'm doing a second project with that same crew and same model. Paul did our layout with them. He's going to come up and just make sure we're all kind of seeing the same thing when we start that project. But I have the ability to grant money to a landowner, which is what I did for my second project in Bates Hole that I highlighted last time. And so then again, with that grant process, we can pay for time and materials. And then the crew, after doing these two larger projects, really has the ability, they kind of understand how much cost goes into it. I have a better understanding, and then I feel like I'll be able to write specifications that are actually can be bid out and quoted and that kind of thing. So that's been my process for getting contractors trained on this, and for me to have a better understanding of what the actual costs of these structures are. And I think it's worked pretty well. The other thing that we have in our agency that my counterpart Todd Kaltrider and I kind of brought online several years ago is kind of some creative ways to do contracting. So we were having some struggles where we were getting money in, but by the time we would put out a contract for an individual project, we'd miss a whole field season. And then also we were doing a lot of the same kind of work over and over again, having to go through the contracting process every time for every new project, and it takes several months to get through that contracting process. So what we did is we created these We call them statewide contracts. They're valid for 3 years, and they're essentially a very flexible project. So we just have different types of components of construction. So right now we have one for BDA, and contractors can bid just based on kind of the length and dimensions of those BDAs. And then we have ways to increase the cost of doing that work based on, say, difficult access, and some other, height of the BDAs and that kind of thing, so that it's really fair for the contractor as well as for us. And it gives us the ability to just get money and then put it into that contract right away. And typically we'll contract with 2 or 3 different contractors under those. And we have to offer the job to the #1 ranked contractor first. We have a ranking process. And if they refuse, we'll go on to the next contractor. So it works pretty well. And, different entities, I think, have their different rules about contracting. And you may not be able to do that, but I think just thinking creatively and outside of the box and thinking about this contracting efficiency is really helpful. So that's actually what we did for Paul's contract with the Game and Fish. We have it for 3 years, the ability to hire him for designs through this kind of flexible statewide contract that we have. And the vision is to do that with implementation of Z-Dike structures as well, and to have a few different contractors who are qualified to be able to get on that list is really the goal there. So just wanted to offer a different perspective about how to go about contracting and getting folks trained to be able to do this. We didn't think it was fair to expect contractors to be able to get trained all on their own. So we've offered some different opportunities to be able to do that. And the other thing I just wanted to touch on right quick is we're talking about, building out RFPs and contracting work out, and putting stipulations on the projects, is to just keep in mind in Wyoming, if we're focusing these projects on sage-grouse core habitat or, sage-grouse habitat at all, just consider the executive order, for some of the private land as well as, other entities. Maybe it's not a consideration, but really in doing the right thing, if we're working in sage-grouse habitat, we should be considering it. So based on the executive order, and there's a few different kind of things that are worth reviewing in there, but generally speaking, we're talking about starting these projects after June 30 would be the timing step if we're in core, and if we're near Lex. Really the concern, I think, is being in those sagebrush habitats that are adjacent to the draws for staging material and having vehicles and skid loaders or whatever you have out there and not crushing nests, I think is a really strong consideration. So, we were visiting about this earlier, and Linette was like, well, I'm working in an area that was burned. And so we were not adhering to those stipulations because we don't have sagebrush in some of these areas. So great, probably not a concern. But I think even just if you are not, looking at having to follow core area stipulations, then just maybe even doing due diligence of walking that area before you go driving a vehicle across through some sagebrush to make sure that you don't have any nests in there, is a pretty important kind of best management practice that we can do. But this work is really well supported. It's considered habitat work. It's de minimis, but there's still timing considerations in there of doing that kind of work. So, for example, in our work with our contractors, we're starting projects by and large, those large projects after July 1, just to kind of dot our I's and cross our T's. And so, I just wanted to throw that out there. Everything is in the executive order itself, but just taking into consideration some of those biological factors, I think, can be really important. So that's really all I had to say.
Perfect. Thank you, Willow, for sharing some of your experiences and process as well, and for helping to give us some additional ideas on approach there. And I also appreciate you providing some clarification on the sage-grouse habitat and how to incorporate that into our decision-making process as well. It's definitely an important component in a lot of these areas where we're working on these projects. It's pretty common for sage-grouse habitat to be in the same regions, and it's a great opportunity for for incorporating that the priority of improving that habitat. And so yeah, do you guys have any more questions on anything we've discussed so far? And Linette did share a couple of documents in the chat, so if you're interested in any of the RFP or other information that she was talking about, you can access those there. And thank you very much for sharing those. And we're going to bring Brian Stampe on now. As I mentioned earlier, he is a contractor. He's been working with Linette on her projects that she's been working on, and he's going to share a little bit with us about kind of the contractor side of things and what his experience has been. I think this is going to be really interesting because we keep talking about it from the perspective of those of us that are arranging these projects, but I think there's going to be a lot of benefit to hearing it from his perspective as well, and in seeing how that can help us in better working with contractors as well. So yeah, so Brian, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks. And thanks for that talk, Willow. That was interesting to hear how you guys have approached it down there. Can people see my screen? What am I sharing?
Yep, we see it. Yep, it's not in slideshow, but we do see your yep, we see your PowerPoint. Yep.
All right, well then I will start. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a short talk on kind of a field-based perspective on building these structures. My name is Brian Stampe. I'm based out of Spearfish, South Dakota. I'm an eco-hydrologist and a conservation contractor that got into this work a couple of years ago with Linette through some training she held and from some help with Paul Jones. And we do the implementation and also starting to do some design work. And we also do some other things, some forestry work, started a wholesale sagebrush nursery recently as well here in Spearfish. So we kind of do a lot of different things. So the goal of this talk is just to share some practical construction insights that we've learned from the field, help folks maybe avoid some common mistakes, and provide some ideas and solutions to common challenges. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, that the restoration goals on these projects really determine the structure types. And that's so important to be reminded of the restoration goals and the physical processes that are happening on the landscape to then determine the structure types and actually implement them in a way that is not just a recipe given from the designer and then you just build them, because there's so many variables that come into the field that you need to adjust these. So even when you're just building these, I think it's important to be reminded, like, what are we trying to do at this specific location? What is the goal of the project? And how can we manipulate the hydrology to achieve that goal? Because you're constantly going to be adjusting on the fly, even if things are really dialed with your design work. So the goal of this talk is just to share some practical construction insights and maybe some common challenges and potential solutions to maybe save some people some time and headache. And I just wanted to touch base on like how the restoration goals really do drive these, what kind of structures we want on the landscape. And that's important even if you're just a builder and you're not doing the design work, because you're often going to have to adjust on the fly. So understanding some of those basic principles is really helpful to be able to make those adjustments, and have your crew kind of trained and competent and confident enough to make those adjustments in the field. So some of the key things we're trying to achieve on a landscape are slowing down and preventing further head cutting. And we do that through things like Zuni bowls, or some of the innovative structures like Willow, or Autumn was talking about. Also rock laybacks or rock rundowns. And then we also do vertical control, meaning we're trying to deposit sediment usually to raise the water table. We use things like one rock dams or wicker weirs. Think slowing water down and then depositing sediment. And then there's another class of structures that kind of augment laterally. And those do things like induce meandering of the stream. Sometimes we're enhancing erosion instead of trying to slow it down. And that often allows us to like reconnect the floodplain, to moisten it, and to kind of spread out the wet meadow. So some important factors are, how do you get this material on site? Where do you source it? How do you select it? How do you get it there? And one of the biggest things is you got to make sure that the rock is the appropriate density. You know, some rock is light, like scoria, and isn't actually much denser than water. And depending on the system you're working in, if you have a very high flow rates, you got to make sure your rock is really dense. That's why it's recommended to use granitic rock, but I think also sedimentary rock of appropriate density can work really well. And then there's proximity, especially in like Wyoming and these rural places. It can cost a lot to haul rock in. And just to give people a sense, side dumps charge around $200 an hour, and they can do 20 to 40 ton a load is all. And that's enough for, say, 10 to 15 structures, maybe. So you're looking at easily $1,000 just in delivery charge to the site for 10 or so structures. And then there's the shape of the rock. Oftentimes, you know, rectangular is going to be best. Rock with planar surfaces that is easy to stack, easy to key together is the fastest to work with. Angular rock is also really good. It's just a little slower. It's harder to spin around in your head because the shapes it's not symmetrical. So it just moves a little slower, but it works well. But round rock, alluvial rock, is not good. And often quarries have alluvial rock and want to sell you that. And so it's really important to actually go visit the quarry, get photos, talk to the people, and really emphasize that you do need flat surface, angular rock to make these structures resilient and locked in together. And then similar to density, you got to make sure you have the right size. You don't want floods yearly or 2-year, 3-year floods to wipe out your structures. And so if you have a bunch of small 3-inch rocks and you get a flood coming in, could totally wipe out the structure. So on average, you're looking to have 6 to 12-inch rocks for the most part. And then you need some larger and a few smaller rocks. But you really got to make sure when you're talking to quarries to emphasize that you need those size systems and to make sure it's screed for that. And you can really just skip on the small rock. There'll be probably some small rock that'll come in, some stuff under 5 inches. It'll just kind of probably sneak its way in with the bigger stuff. But for the most part, you just don't don't need much of that unless you're filling like rock core wicker weirs. You can use it, but in a lot of instances, it's not super useful. So how do you estimate how much material you need? You know, let's say you're a project coordinator or a contractor bidding on these, trying to figure out how much this is going to cost. Going out with the design and actually measuring the size of what you think the structure will be at each site and recording that is really helpful. And here's a photo of Linette and I measuring a head cut. And it's also really important to make sure you're actually measuring the size of the future structure, not the size of the head cut. Because often when you build these, you have to excavate back a couple feet to get the appropriate angle to the head cut to then build up a Zuni bowl, for instance. And if that wasn't done originally in the design process, it's good to note that, and as a contractor to ask the designer and to communicate about how exactly things were measured. Because if you're off 20% here and then 20% here, those things can compound, and you can have twice as much rock or half as much rock. And that definitely can mess with your workflow, and you might be waiting on materials. So you want to try to hit that as close as you can on the initial estimate. And so when you measure, you get a length, a width, a height, and you multiply all those together, you get a volume. And that volume is assuming some kind of rectangular prism, like down on the bottom here. Is that really the best shape that fits the structure? You know, probably not. So I guess I just want to encourage folks that, like, you're not putting a box on the landscape, but that's what you're using to estimate. So I have found it's something more like a half of that rectangular prism that you're actually filling with material. So I just wanted to go through, I know the in-person was going to be the best for the building process, but I wanted to go through an example of how to build, say, a Zuni bowl, just to give people a little bit of a sense of that before they show up in the field. So Zuni bowls are used to mitigate head cut movement upstream. And so you'll be on a head cut, and the first step is to cut back that head cut, make it even wider, make it even bigger, which sometimes at first doesn't feel like the intuitive approach, but you've got to lay it back such that you've got a nice angle to be working with. If you just try to stack things vertically, it'll be too steep and you won't really be dissipating the energy of the flow. So you cut back the head cut to a nice angle, and it makes it quite a bit bigger, 1 to 2 feet, maybe even sometimes 3 feet larger in diameter. And then you also decide where your splash apron is going to be and dig out a trench to put in your pavers or your flat rocks there. Then the next step is to lay your footers and your dam exit. And then this next step is really important to get right. You need to level, kind of lay rock or blocks, whatever you're using, in a way that is level and follows the arch of your head cut. And as you build up, you'll notice how important it is to get this first one level so that you have kind of a predictable building surface. And if you're using blocks, I suspect this step is really important because you don't have different sizes to adjust for low spots or high spots. So getting this footer row in is really important for the overall structure process. As you can see, you just kind of add up layers, setting them back stacked on top and also angled slightly downward. And that way, as things shift, gravity naturally settles the rock back in towards the head cut. That's like a key little detail that's easy to miss, but is important for, you know, the longevity of these structures actually working on the landscape is that as things settle and shift, they naturally like tighten up and move towards the back of the head cut. You know, ultimately it'll be vegetation filling in and locking everything together, but this just helps prevent further erosion on the backside. And so this is almost complete. You'll notice that the top row is level with the surface, so that there's zero height difference between the top of the head cut and the rock structure. If you make it too proud, water wants to go around and it side cuts. And if you make it too low, you don't necessarily stop the head cut and you have a miniature kind of waterfall at the top of your structure that can eventually, the energy can start to erode the backside of the structure. So you really need it flush level with the top of the head cut. And then for the last step, we fill in the bottom with less desirable rock, smaller rock, and that creates this nice pool surface that won't be eroded and can allow the cascade to hit that bottom and not shift around so much. So time estimates, I suppose contractors will be really keen to hear this. It really depends on who's doing the job. Some people are really motivated and able to spin rocks around in their head and in the field and find the right rock for the right spot and really move quickly. And other folks move a little more slowly, a little more particularly. And so, you know, I would say these are big ranges, 4 to 8 hours for a small one rock dam and 8 to 20 hours for a large Zuni bowl. It really does depend on the size of your rock, the people you have working. And these estimates are for if the rock is already delivered in stage to the site location, like immediate vicinity of the structure. And then mobilization and demobilization is like obviously a big time suck. Depending on where you're working, you know, there's a lot of like time just setting up camp and get moving. You know, the first day of work might end up being a half day just because of all that. And then the material logistics and timing of all that takes, you know, a third to a half even of the job to get the material to the actual structure site. Okay, so here are some common challenges I want to go through and potential ways to mitigate these. So piping through these systems, especially in really fine sediment soils, is a really big concern. And piping is, you know, the term we use for just water moving through the structure relatively unencumbered, moving quickly and thus eroding faster than it's depositing. So here's a really small one rock dam that was built, and you know, there's a couple things they did well, and there's a couple things that maybe weren't done super well. So maybe I'll just give you a moment to kind of look at it and assess and see what you might do differently. So first of all, the flow of water is coming from the smooth side on the left to the roughed up side on the right. And it is depositing on the front of the structure, so that's a hopeful sign. But you can see that soon after it hits the rocks, it starts to move fast, and it's not actually depositing this clay-rich soil inside the structure. It's speeding up and not depositing anything there. It's exiting the structure, water falling even off the top and scouring the backside. So to prevent that, this structure should have a splash apron dug into the backside, which makes this really obvious. And B, the rocks should be keyed in tighter, and that really reduces the size of the pipes. And as the pipes get smaller and smaller through the structure, it creates more roughness and more friction. It slows water down. When water slows down, it has less erosive power and is more likely to deposit instead of erode. And, you know, it's just not maybe deep enough. Like, it could be double the size, and that would also double the amount of roughness and obstacles that water hits as it's moving through. Furthermore, I like the use of the larger 6 to 12-inch rocks here, but this would be a good opportunity to get rid of the smaller stuff on the front end of the structure. And those smaller rocks also really increase the amount of roughness that water's going to encounter. I will say they did do a decent job of keying the structure into the side of the bank here. You can see that the water is not going around and not cutting the outside of it, which is a really good detail that they were able to achieve. Another challenge is simply too round of rock. And I made a whole slide for this because I really want to emphasize that if you're building a Zuni bowl, it makes it so much easier to have planar surfaces to work with. It's really slow and frustrating to have round cobble try to build these structures. It just takes longer. It doesn't feel as stable when you're done, and it is gonna, you know, paying for that extra transport or whatever it is to get the planar rock, I think really is worth it. And if you have planar sedimentary rock, you can beat them up along their planes and split them and actually use, you know, make really nice flat pieces for splash aprons or whatever. It really doesn't take that much work if you have sedimentary planar rock to do that. And as long as it's dense enough not to be moved by water, like this is limestone that has, it's like 75% as typical metamorphic or granitic rock. And it's much more dense than water. So I'm confident that this limestone's not going anywhere. So another common challenge is getting these structures to have zero entry and exit, meaning when the water comes in, it doesn't want to side cut, and when it leaves, it doesn't have a cascade that is creating more erosive, basically a mini head cut at the toe of the structure. And this is where like the fine details really matter when you're out in the field. And when it's hot and you're tired, it's easy to start to kind of soften your detail in these areas. And I think it's just really important and a reminder that the zero entry and the zero exit are really key for longevity of these structures. So how can you set up to prevent that? Well, getting planar rock is nice because you can always use planar rock to make these nice flat surfaces for entry and exit. And also pavers aren't too expensive, you know, about $4 a square foot, you know, plus transport, doesn't add too much to each structure, you know, $50 to $100 or so. And that, you know, lessens the time and the amount of labor per structure for sure. And I think it increases the likelihood that these are going to not erode away. The other key bit there is to really make sure you're digging in your splash apron deep enough so that you're not trying to go back after the structure is built and trying to pull out pieces and redig it. You can just go in at the beginning and dig a nice deep splash apron. You can always add a little more soil in there that's loose if you dig it too deep, but it's a lot harder to get it deeper again. And then just making sure everything's keyed in very well, taking your time to fit pieces together nicely, really goes a long way here. So another common issue with some of these structures is side cutting. And that basically just means that water comes in, hits some kind of dam or structure and fills up a bit and then finds the easiest path around the structure. And that can easily start to erode the edges of your structure and eventually wash out the entire structure. And so to mitigate that, I think it's really important when building these, when designing these, to be aware of the bank full width. And Paul talked about this a few weeks ago, but just as a reminder, the bank full width is basically the point at which water is going to slow down because it has access to the inset floodplain, and now it has a lot more room to move a certain amount of flow, and so it kind of spreads its energy out better. And so if you can make sure you're bringing the edges of your structure up into that bank full width, when you do get a flood, water will move up into this low energy floodplain and won't be moving so fast and is a lot less likely to scour around the edges and side cut. So it's really, really important to be aware of bank full width when you're building these and be working with that and keying your structures up into the bank full width so that they, withstand flooding. Okay, another challenge are hard soils. Here we used handheld gas-powered augers to auger in these posts, which worked really good in early July in decent soil. It was really fast. It was really quite surprising. And then by late July, early August, it just stopped working. The soils, the clays got dry, and we could only get like 6 inches in. So if you can time it when it's going to be moist, I know there's some, Willow talked about, you don't want to be mindful of the sage grouse and working with people to make sure you're in at an appropriate time, but getting posts in when it's slightly wet is a lot easier. And, if you can't do that, I think using machinery lightly is a real practical approach for getting posts in quickly, efficiently, cheaply. If you've got a skilled operator, you can get in with minimal amount of damage to auger or post pound these in. But it seems like even handheld hydraulic post pounders struggle in the really dry, hard pan soil of central Wyoming in August, late June, or late July, excuse me. But if none of those options are possible, we did find a method that worked. Drilling a 16-inch deep pilot hole that's 3/4 of an inch, and then filling that pilot hole with a liter of water, and that kind of soaks the surrounding soil just enough to auger it. It's really time consuming if you've got hundreds of posts to install, but it is possible to do it without machinery in dry soils. Yeah, wouldn't recommend it for large scale though. And you have to be careful working with water and clay because you can fill up an entire hole and clay when it becomes saturated, it becomes impermeable. So you only really want to do a pilot hole because you can create this saturated layer that is actually impermeable to water and won't moisten the surrounding soil. So caveats to that. Another challenge is just sourcing willows. If you're doing a lot of wicker weaves, they take a lot of willows, and that takes time. But we have found like having a sawyer, a trained sawyer with a chainsaw makes that go really quite quick, at least cutting them down. And as far as the estimates go, we found that like one dump trailer, 14-foot dump trailer, like packed over the brim, seems to yield around 7 to 10 medium-sized rock core wicker weave, which have the double rows of posts, or more on the order of 20 single row wicker weaves, just as like a rough estimate for folks. Yeah, and if you start early, you can kind of get some of that work done before you're actually on the site, just to try to get ahead of the curve. Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to, I'd be remiss if I didn't like mention the magnitude of this challenge, but also that it can feel really good when there's multiple people like all of you working to mitigate some of these head cuts and improve this habitat. And it's really inspiring to see all the different projects going on, and that's really motivating. And I've got one little video, 30 seconds I want to show before I wrap up. Just on this note of like seeing these projects kind of scale up. This is some drone footage that one of Linette's, I believe, friends took on our project over in the Balsa Draw. And it just shows the complexes of these structures and how a little example of how they stack up together, and hopefully gives people encouragement that, you know, we can scale this work up to hit the landscape level. Awesome. Well, yeah, and I just, thanks for your time and your attention. And I just wanted to leave with some open-ended questions of what has worked for you guys, and what challenges have you faced and how have you overcome them? And yeah, thanks for listening.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. That was very in-depth into some of the challenges that you have experienced and some of the things that you've learned through this process. And yeah, really appreciate you taking some time to share that. We do have a question from Matt Pollock. Do you encounter problems with willows drying out and becoming stiff and difficult to weave if you cut them too early?
Yeah, that was a big concern, but it wasn't actually too much of a problem. If we put the posts 18-inch centers, with 3-inch posts at 18-inch centers, the angle that you have to weave them isn't too extreme, and it really wasn't too bad. But yeah, that's a really good question.
Melanie Purcell is works for Sublette County Conservation District and has been working on this type of work for a few years up there now. And I had a chance a couple of years ago to go and tour some of their project sites, and I'm super excited and impressed with the work that they're doing, and very much want all of you to see that and what they've learned from their experience and stuff. So yes, Melanie, I am so sorry. Let's jump in and have Melanie share about some of the work that they're doing over on the west side of the state. So
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I appreciate it. I was kind of giggling here because as you were talking about the rain, we've been getting a little bit of rain here, and I just happened to turn and look out my window, and it's snowing here right now. So I doubt it will last long, but you never know. It's spring weather. So yeah, thank you for having me. I'll just kind of go into my presentation. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah.
Yep, it
Okay.
looks good.
Okay. So yeah. Initially, we started having, let me see if I can get this to switch now, discussions back in 2020 with partners. So we engaged like the NRCS, the Nature Conservancy, Game and Fish, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and kind of just started talking about, doing some of this type of work in our area. So we secured some funding to do a workshop and start implementing some initial projects. And so our goal through this workshop was to provide an opportunity for landowners and managers in the area to adopt these types of technologies for music habitat restoration. Our thought at the time was to kind of get landowner buy-in, because in our area, having that landowner buy-in is just really important to helping scaling things up in the long run. So that was sort of our goal initially. So our workshop was actually on a ranch like that's off of a county road. But to achieve our goals, we, what we wanted to do was sort of provide some education to landowners and other managers on the techniques and get that buy-in. So we did some articles, provided resources to people, and then of course held the workshop in which we wanted to implement several different types of structures that we could take people out to and show them off at like demonstration projects. And then, of course, as everybody's been talking about scaling up, we wanted to transfer that across the landscape scale. And then we also wanted to monitor the efficacy of some of those structures the best that we could. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a few before and after pictures of what we saw. This was during the workshop. You can see we're in an area pretty dry, not a lot of vegetation there. And that was August 2021. And then during the spring melt we had put some cameras out and which captured like them catching that snow and that spring runoff in that following March. And by July, when we went out and did a tour, you can see how much vegetation was already growing in around those structures. So that was pretty cool to see. Now, this is in an area of the county that does receive a little bit more precipitation, but it was really cool to see on the rock structures, like um, the improvement so quickly in this area. And here's just a few more before and after pictures. There's a One Rock Dam, and then that picture below it right here is about a year and a half later. And you can see how much vegetation is coming in. And this was just the first year post structures, just showing how much sediment was already being deposited behind those structures. It was cool just to see that they were doing what they were supposed to do. And then we also had the BDA workshop at the same location. It was on a different stream. The ephemeral stream that we did the ZEDIC projects on actually drains into this creek, which is Willow Creek. This picture here kind of just shows those BDAs holding that water above bankful during melt off. So it's pretty impressive, like how far that water reached that stream. This is sort of the normal size of it. I like to include this picture just because it's fun to watch that antelope jump in the stream. You don't see that very often. But what was really cool about this project is that the rancher that we worked with, his ranch manager was very smart and very economically minded. And they were super skeptical about these structures going in and what they could do. And so some of their option or observations that they found is that, she was like, these structures, when we herd our cattle through here, are going to be destroyed. They're not even going to be standing anymore. But they withstood traffic from 550 yearlings in there for 2 days, and then also from 2,200 animals being pushed through the area twice. They noticed that the green line lasted longer. It was still visible in late July, and it's usually visible for maybe up to 4 weeks in the year, so maybe through June. And then she also noticed that plant vigor and regrowth were noticeable. So normally they would only graze 400 pairs for 2 weeks and they wouldn't see any growth. But after these structures were implemented, they actually grazed it twice. They grazed it with the 400 pairs early in the season, and then the 550 yearlings a little bit later. And then they still saw regrowth after that. And then another thing was that because the structures slowed water and held water in the system up higher longer, they were able to keep cows in there longer. And they actually were able to graze their upper pasture above this site that they normally would never be able to graze even in a wet late spring year. So they ended up being really impressed with it. And because of her economic abilities, she actually punched some numbers and found that at $1.80 a pound for beef at the time, you had 220 animals in that pasture for 1 extra day with 2 pounds gain each per day. That equated to about an extra $1,000 revenue for that year. So yeah, they were very impressed with those structures. So it's just interesting because it's one, you don't have landowners that give you that information very often, and I don't know that we'll ever have another landowner do that, but just to be able to talk about that and the experience here is a pretty cool thing. So anyhow, we also, because of our game cams, we worked with a Game and Fish videographer, and so I thought I would take a moment to show you our time-lapse videos. I have one for the ZDICs and one for the BDAs, and so I'll go ahead and show you the ZDIC one now. So it's kind of a fun little video. Here's the BDA one as well. it's kind of fun to have those videos. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed those. And anyway, I'll go ahead and move on. So as far as scaling up in our county, we had our workshop initially in 2021, and this is sort of the area that we had it in. And then with that workshop and some of the matching funds that we had, we implemented our first projects. This project with the Yellow Star is an ongoing project, and this is actually the third year that they're should be able to finish and putting the structures in this year. And then there's actually a second draw on that will be starting as well, or implementing as well. So I have I'll talk a little bit more about that project in a little bit, but because of the workshop also, we were able to partner with our BLM, our local BLM office, and help them with some designing and project implementation down in their greater North LaBarge restoration ecosystem area. So they have a lot of stuff going on down there now as well. And then TNC secured some funding to create 6 music habitat restoration positions across the West. And so one of those positions is here at the conservation district. And so between that funding and then some additional funding that we secured, we're going to begin implementation on some of the projects we have planned this year. We have 3 of them on private land, and then 4 sites on the Mesa, which is oil and gas area. But it'll be interesting to see what those projects do out there. And then we have 1 BDA project. I think it's this one right here on Muddy Creek that we were hoping to implement it this year, but it may end up being next year just because of some design changes and things that happen and permitting and those kind of things. And then, this is a partner project that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is leading. And there's several stars that aren't on here because I don't know where all the project locations are. But we will be hired. We have hired a conservation corps crew. This is the first time for us, so it'll be a new experience for us working with them to begin implementation on these projects this year. And so, and I know people have been talking about challenges and things like that, and I had planned on doing challenges and lessons learned, and then I was sort of questioned, others playing devil's advocate on what was actually a challenge versus just something. Anyway, so I went with the word reflections, and so I guess I just wanted to provide some tips and just talk about some of the things that we've experienced along the way. And so one of those things is to just be patient and keep moving forward. Things rarely go as planned, and I think, and it can be really frustrating or discouraging at times. We had initially planned on doing our workshop in 2020, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that delayed that workshop and the other projects that we had, and cut the time we had for our funding short. And so, we just had to keep moving forward and do our best. But what it did do is it gave us more time to plan, and it allowed us to incorporate some virtual classroom training modules the NRCS and Intermountain West Joint Venture had developed at the time. So that saved us, having to do that and the workshop all at one time, kind of similar to what you guys are doing. So that worked out really great. Materials, rock availability was an issue in our area as well. We have primarily round rock around here, and I don't know how many different companies I called to try to find out if they could get us the rock that we needed. They most of them provided like gravel and didn't have the equipment to get the rock recipe that we wanted. And so we did eventually find one one supplier that we could get rock from. You know, and we'll probably have to branch out and at some point and start thinking about other types of materials and other suppliers that are maybe a little farther away, depending on, you know, how that source goes. And then also just permitting process. It's a learning process if you haven't done it, and it's long and it's complicated. And the earlier you can start on that, the better. You know, ideally, you want to do your permitting over the winter so that you're ready to implement in the spring. But that doesn't always work out the way you hope. So, and then relationships are important. I know you guys have heard a lot of this probably throughout your workshop. But you know, our partners have been really key. They've been like essential in helping with certain tasks, others that have worked through the permitting process to help us work through some of the different calculations they ask for and you know, different things that are needed, and helping with NEPA. You know, our BLM office helped get that done for the areas that we plan on for this year. And then, you know, we've been able to provide rock materials and BDA posts to other partners. So just having those relationships can really help a project move further along. And then I thought it was really, you know, project assistance and staff turnover. That has been interesting. You know, we had hired a person for this music habitat position, and that person left. And so after a year, these projects were semi-planned, and then I had to step in the interim and try to figure out, you know, what everything, you know, what everything was, what stage it was in, and what needed to be done. And then Cameron, who is attending your workshop, she's taking over that project, that position. And so it's been really a blessing to be able to work together and kind of figure things out and, you know, just help each other basically. And then just having landowners, you know, landowner, like I said earlier, landowner and permittee willingness and buy-in is something to always try to keep in mind. I had watched a Bill Zedek webinar a while back where, you know, one of his favorite sayings was pull, don't push. I think he got it from, you know, using a saw, but I thought it was actually a really good point, because you want to pull people along with you. You want to plant the seeds. You don't want your landowners to think their livestock are always going to have to be excluded from these projects. So, you know, when you push people, they tend to push back. And so just being able to kind of work with people and what they need as well is helpful in moving projects forward. And then, you know, pick the low-hanging fruit. Some of those projects are really big and those are great, but to be able to get started, like, you know, ask yourself where you're at. What is your site? Are you in a big gully, or are you in an area with a shallow head cut? What are you protecting in that area? Are you protecting the meadow above it? Or are you protecting, you know, what is it what are your goals for that project? And then what buy-in do you have for those projects, and what are your permitting needs? Maybe it makes sense to start in ephemeral drainage where you don't need as much permitting versus in a perennial stream, you know, kind of just like working through some of that and where to start so that you can keep the wheels turning. And then, so I guess finally, I would just say be creative and have fun. You know, I thought it was really cool to see some of the structures from your presentations that you're working on, because we have some unique sites here too that we're kind of throwing around ideas. This project here is actually the one I mentioned that is the third year in the making, and this head cut was at the very bottom of that drainage. And we were kind of just like, you know, this would be a huge swimming pool. It'd be basically a swimming pool. And, you know, we initially talked about that, you know, it's about 3 feet deep, but we felt like we really needed to do something here because it was at the bottom of that drainage. And so it was going to keep like cutting up until, you know, it met our structures or went around our structures above or whatever. And so I think, you know, and then we talked about a post structure. I can't recall exactly what type of structure it was that we were going to build. And then in the end, we kind of went with this modified rock layback, and it really seems to be doing working, at least initially. And so just being able to ask other people what they think, even experts get tunnel vision sometimes. And so I think having talking to people and getting a unique perspective from others can be helpful. And then you know, we found too that in these projects with volunteers and partners, that instead of assigning people to groups to work on structures, that the crews really just sorted themselves out. Some people were natural masons, some people were really good at like sorting through sizes of rocks and bringing it to different structures. So allowing people to jump around and work in different groups, at least for us, was worked out really well. So anyway, that's just a few things, I guess, from our area that we've experienced and whatnot. So I thank you all again, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for sharing. Yeah, they're doing some great work over in Sublette County. It's really fun to see some of that work. And so, yeah, you guys have any questions for Melanie on any of that? There's a couple comments in the chat for you too, Melanie, about commenting on the good before and after photos that you have and how important those can be, and selling further projects, and also documenting the success of current projects. And then also excitement about the wildlife usage that you're able to see, and the ability to hold water and the forage response in those areas too. So from your projects. So yeah, well, there's not any more questions or anything for Melanie. I did remember that we were going to have Paul share briefly about a structure that they built recently, kind of a new process for building a Z-dike structure. And he put a couple photos in the chat. If you scroll back up to the top of the chat, you can look at those. Paul, did you want to talk about those for just a couple minutes real quick?
Yeah, so this project is taking place here in Western Colorado, just above the Colorado National Monument, a place called Pinyon Mesa, on the 28-hole ranch. And working with the Colorado West Land Trust, and I'm sure you guys are aware there's some challenges on some of our grant funding processes right now, and so they had 7 weeks of WCCC crew lined up, but then they didn't have the grant money that was going to be used to get materials and things like that fell through. And so what we did is we actually combined a pinyon juniper removal project that the funding fell through for as well, and we took the YCC crew and we're actually using them to remove pinyon and juniper, and then we're using the pinyon and juniper to build structures. So we're kind of taking two different projects and trying to tie them together to see if we can meet some common objectives. And one of the things that we looked at, we knew we were removing a bunch of juniper but we had some big zuni bowls and we only had rock enough for one or two of them. And so we wanted to try and figure out another alternative. So if you go to the top of the chat, you'll see these photos. And the very first photo is just one I pulled off of the internet. I was thinking about how they build kivas down on the Navajo reservation, and I knew that they built them in these stacked kind of tiers of wood. So I just took this picture with me into the field and gave it to one of my crew members to put together. And the following two photos are the bowl that she built out of that. So basically, we started with juniper logs laying up and down in the bottom of the channel, and then she built the just like Brian was talking about. The next level was basically the dam at the bottom, and then she laid another set of logs kind of diagonal to that, and just kind of started building it up in tiers. We used a few bolts, a few of the timber framing bolts that we'll play with this next week, but much of it was done primarily with wood stakes. We had a lot of material that we could turn into stakes, and so yeah, the next there's the picture from the bottom and then the picture from the top. And we took a bunch of the boughs and we packed them in between layers, and in between logs themselves. The next step is to build a one rock dam, or it's actually going to be a one log dam down below to backfill into those logs, because we didn't have any good footer rocks for our splash apron. So we're going to we'll build a one rock dam downstream that produces a pool, and water coming out of the Zuni bowl will fall into that pool and will dissipate energy that way. But this is just another example of, when life gives you lemonades, or life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. So, and the landowner was absolutely delighted with it. He's super excited and very happy with how he's getting basically two projects done with one. It's a little slower, kind of collecting your material on site and whatnot. But the bowl itself, the wood bowl, time-wise, she built it. Brian mentioned that, those Zuni bowls, depending on size, run about 12 person hours to build, and she was able to build this in about 10, and that was a prototype. So actually, I think we can build some of these log Zuni bowls, maybe even a little faster, probably fairly comparable to what we can build them out of brick with. So that was kind of exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing, Paul. I think it's really neat to see, different options, different materials, different approaches to these types of structures and these challenges. And I did want to share as well, and Autumn's not here, but she shared this with us a while back. This is a project that they worked on up in Montana, and it was kind of similar, where they had a head cut that they needed to address, but they didn't have a lot of access to rock close by, but they had lots of juniper and pine. I think it was a lot of ponderosa in this area, but and they had access to some what do you call these, erosion sock deals, and so they were able to use those as fill along with the branches, and kind of make a hybrid wicker weir type of structure here. And she said that it's actually working pretty well. And so that's another picture of, I'm not sure if that's the same structure or a different one. I think it might be the same one later on. But kind of accomplishing a similar end, but using different material. So again, something to think about. And so with that, are there any other, let me see. Waddles, yes, thank you, Casey. I always forget that name for some reason. But I did want to talk a little bit about our upcoming workshop. So for those of you that are planning to join us next week, that is going to be Tuesday and Wednesday, the 20th and 21st, here in Newcastle. And we're super excited to have you guys come and join us. And we have been working hard on getting our site prepped and ready to go, and staging materials. And yeah, that's a lot of work. So Brian is definitely not underestimating the time it takes to just get material to the site, you know, let alone getting it out to where you're building the structures and everything else. So we are hoping to have some of that done. There probably will be some left to do next week as well, possibly too, I think. So, but that'll be all part of the experience for everybody as well. So, we are planning on meeting here at my office, which is in the USDA Forest Service building in Newcastle, and about 8 o'clock in the morning. I'd like to try and leave about 8 to head out to the project site. So plan on being here maybe about 7:45. And if you're coming from another direction, I can get you directions on how to get there. It's pretty simple. We'll be right there at the junction of highways 116 and 450, kind of the southwestern part of Weston County. So it should be pretty easy to get there. And so I am going to send out a tools checklist that Paul shared with me that kind of lays out some of the common tools that we're going to need for this project. And so any of those tools that you're able to bring with you would be helpful and help speed up the process, I think, too, so we can spread out and work on multiple projects at the same time. We'll kind of break up into any groups to work on some different structures, and we'll kind of tag team this project here. And if you want to bounce around a little bit too, and see some different structures and get experience with some different materials, you can do that too. So it'll be pretty free flowing, but I'm excited to get you guys out there. We did send out some information on lodging as well. Just some lodging options, I think, and options for getting food and stuff too. So and really Upton, Wyoming has a really nice hotel. It's pretty new. And Upton's actually about the same drive time as it is to get to Newcastle from the project site. So you could consider staying at either one of those locations. And if you guys have any other questions on anything, facilities or accommodations or whatever, feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, no, that's great. So thank you guys very much for joining us today. If anybody has any further questions, we can stick on and answer those. Otherwise, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this third virtual session, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. And feel free to reach out if you have any more questions or anything about next week. So